Guys, I am flabbergasted. Flabbergasted. Don't you just love that word? I am flabbergasted. No, I'm really bad at doing accents. But anyway, it's my Canon M50. Remember my video about the cinematic camera moves? Well, when I saw that footage, wow, it was even better than I expected. Especially this part here, when the sun started to set and then with the right color grade, it really surprised me. It looks more cinematic than I could have hoped for, keeping in mind that it's such a cheap camera. Now, after I dropped that video, a lot of you asked me about my camera settings, so in this video, I'll show you my camera settings for cinematic video. Well, there actually isn't such a thing as cinematic camera settings, but the camera settings you need for that specific look. I'll also show you what the difference is when you use different settings, why it looks different. Oh, and these settings work for the Canon M50, but also pretty much any other camera out there. Okay guys, but first of all, again, thank you all for subscribing. At the moment, we are at a whopping, wait, let me check. We are at 3,355 subscribers. That's amazing. It's a weird feeling that more than 3,000 people are willing to watch my videos, but also a great feeling. The support and motivation I get from that is through the roof. So if you're new here, maybe consider subscribing too. It's fun and I have a lot of cool stuff planned, so there you go. Anyway, back to my camera settings for cinematic video. The first thing you need to do is install a flat picture profile. My Canon M50, like most cameras out there, has a few default picture profiles, but if you want a cinematic look, you need a flat profile. I use the CineStyle profile. It's not perfect because it has some noise in the shadows when you're shooting in low light, but overall I really like the result. Maybe check out this video right here for more about the CineStyle profile, and I'll put the download link in the description. Now, if your camera supports C-Log or S-Log or anything like that, then use that. Unfortunately, my Canon M50 doesn't support a real log profile. But some of you have mentioned in the comments that there are more profiles out there for the Canon M50 and other Canon cameras, so maybe put it again in the comments and then I'll put those in the description. I also found out that you can make your own personal picture profile, and that's really cool. You need a picture style editor. At the moment I'm playing around with it, but I haven't created my personal profile yet. But anyway, the bottom line is that you need a flat profile, because if you want a cinematic look, you need to color grade, and that's what the flat profile is all about. It looks bad straight out of camera, but you can create your own look, your own cinematic look when color grading. You can try with one of the built-in profiles, but it will never be the same. If you want the cinematic look, then you need to color grade. So after this video, check out some videos on color grading. Slow motion is super popular, but this video is not about slow motion. I've talked about this a few times now. On YouTube, a lot of times slow motion and cinematic are used for the same thing. But slow motion doesn't have anything to do with the cinematic look, not at all. The best frame rate for the cinematic look is 24 frames per second for normal speed footage. Most Hollywood movies are shot in 24 frames per second. It's the standard. Now, it's not wrong to use slow motion. If you want to use slow motion, then shoot in 60 or 120 frames per second and slow it down. But if you're shooting a short film or cinematic video sequence without slow motion, then do not shoot in 60 or 120 frames per second, because your footage will look and feel different. It will look more like the news, sharper and a lot less movie-like. 24 frames per second creates that slight motion blur, and that's what you need for the cinematic look. Now, if your camera doesn't support 24, then just use 25, that's fine too. The correct setting for shutter speed is actually pretty simple. Always double the frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, then your shutter speed should be 1/48th of a second. My Canon doesn't support 1/48th of a second, so I just use 1/50th. As close as possible to 1/48th. That's because there are 24 frames in a second, so ideally your shutter should open and close 24 times in a second. 1/48th of a second to open and 1/48th of a second to close. Am I doing that right? Am I calculating correctly here? I'm not sure. I'm really bad at math. So maybe you do the math and then let me know. Anyway, this is the rule to get the most natural movement in your videos. If the shutter speed is too slow, everything will look too blurry. And if it's too fast, everybody will look like robots or something. So one simple rule, Shutter speed, double the frame rate. And also, you should never touch frame rate and shutter speed while you're shooting a project, unless you want to mix slow motion with normal speed footage. Don't try to drop a clip that you shot at 60 frames per second on a 24 frames per second timeline and think it will look fine. At first sight, it does look fine, but if you look closer, it's not the same. So for the cinematic look, normal speed footage, shoot at 24 frames per second. Shutter speed 1/48 of a second. Next up is the aperture, and this will drastically change the look of your footage. A low aperture number, 2.8, 2.0 or 1.4, creates a shallow depth of field. The lower the number, the wider the aperture in the lens opens. By the way, the aperture is just a hole in the lens where the light goes in. The higher the number, the smaller the hole is, and that will create a deep depth of field. More objects in the frame will be in focus. It's not a rule or anything, but in a lot of movies they also use a shallow depth of field, and I also like that look to separate the subject from the background. But why does it look so nice? Well, that's actually because your eyes, when you look at your hand for example, you can feel that the objects behind your hand are out of focus. You can't really see it because as soon as you look at those objects, your eyes adjust focus. So in real life, you can never really see out of focus objects. Unless you're drunk, maybe. Yeah, probably unless you're drunk. But anyway, so in a movie, when they use a shallow depth of field, you can actually see those out of focus parts. You can focus on the out of focus things. Something you can't do in real life. And it looks very pleasing to our eye. Of course, use depth of field to tell the story. You don't have to use a shallow depth of field all the time. Now, sometimes there's a problem when you're shooting in bright daylight and you really want that shallow depth of field because your aperture is all the way open and your footage will most likely be overexposed, too much light. That's when you need an ND filter. An ND filter is like sunglasses for your camera. It blocks the light so that you can keep the aperture open for that shallow depth of field without overexposing the footage. Just check out this video right here where I explain a little bit more about those ND filters. They should be in any filmmaker's camera bag. ISO, yeah, so I'm not gonna go into the technical side of things because I might say something wrong and I know there are haters out there who will never forgive me for that. Just try to remember this: when you're shooting video, try to keep the ISO as low as possible. My Canon M50 for example has problems in low light with noise, so I like to keep the ISO as low as possible. And this is for most cameras the case. I always try to keep the ISO low. The higher you set it, the noisier your footage will look. Now, some cameras will have a relatively high ISO for shooting log. I think ISO 800 is very common when you're shooting in a real log profile, but it depends on your camera. Just check the manual, see what it says about ISO values for video. Sometimes a camera has a native ISO for shooting video. I think it's called native ISO or something. Anyway, the ISO basically boosts the sensitivity of your sensor. So if you're shooting in the dark and your aperture is already all the way open, you know, as much light as possible can go through, but your footage still looks too dark, then you can bump up the ISO. You have to, because you cannot touch the shutter speed. It's different from photography, where in a lot of cases you can change the shutter speed without changing the look of your image. That's important to remember. For video, shutter speed stays fixed with your frame rate. And you change the exposure only by changing ISO, aperture, but then you also change the look, remember, depth of field, or you use an ND filter. That's the best option. And finally, manual focus. It's always a good idea to shoot in manual focus because autofocus is really good these days, but it's not perfect and people will notice autofocus when it starts hunting. That's when the autofocus loses focus and tries to find it again. Even the slightest focus hunting looks bad and amateurish. Not cinematic at all. So use manual focus and plan your shots. Plan distances from camera to subject. It's more difficult, but it will look better and more cinematic. When shooting movies, often there are two guys, one to move the camera and one to pull focus. Or they can even program the focus. That's how it works. They'll never use just plain autofocus. Of course, if you're by yourself, it's almost impossible to move the camera and then at the same time do manual focus. So just set your focus manually before you start shooting and then just leave it. Maybe check out the channel of Daniel Schiffer. He's really good at shooting manual focus. Et voila, that's it. 6 cinematic camera settings. Doesn't matter what camera you have. With some of these settings you can play around a little bit, like aperture, depth of field, you know, but some of these settings you set and never touch while shooting. And now it's up to you. Get out there, create something. Even the cheapest camera might surprise you. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next one.